Native Canadians are believed to have migrated from Asian lands about 11,000 years ago. For thousands of years, they hunted on the land, fished in the waters, and gathered wild vegetation. The first Europeans arrived about 1,000 years ago, when Leif Erikson, a Norse seaman, and his crew were blown off course when attempting to sail from Iceland to Greenland. Instead, they wound up on what is today Canada's east coast. It took about 500 years before any more Europeans would arrive. In 1497, and again in 1498, John Cabot, an Italian explorer whose voyages were underwritten by the English government, explored much of the coastal areas of what would someday become Canada and the United States, especially on his second voyage, whose route is shown here. Cabot's exploration party returned to England with glowing reports of rich fishing waters in the western Atlantic. Within a few years, European fishing vessels made yearly voyages to these teeming waters. But it wasn't fish that brought Europeans to the mainland. It was beaver. For in Europe, beaver pelt hats had become all the rage, and the popularity of those hats fostered a large market for beaver fur. To assist fur trappers and traders, the French set to work, building several small colonies in the late 16th century to act as a base for the fur trade. The area around these colonies was called Acadia. But the colonies were not permanent settlements. That would come later in 1608, when Quebec, the first of many French settlements, was established. Quebec was headed by Samuel de Champlain, a noted geographer and explorer. Champlain eventually became governor of what was called New France, a large area of northeastern North America ruled by the French king, at that time Louis XIII. Louis gave large portions of land in the New World to some members of the French nobility. They, in turn, rented those lands to commoners for a portion of the crops harvested and animals trapped. It was the same system that was used in Europe. France's 17th century adversary, England, especially King Charles II, kept a wary eye on French developments in the New World. The British monarch had his own plans for establishing a presence in North America. In 1670, Charles granted the Hudson's Bay Company exclusive trading rights to all the lands whose rivers and streams drained into Hudson Bay, a huge area encompassing hundreds of thousands of square miles. To counter this intrusion, the French and their Indian allies attacked English forts in the Hudson Bay region in the 1680s, but were unable to defeat them. Skirmishes between French and English forces in North America, one of which is shown in this battle map, were seen throughout much of the early 18th century, as the rivalry between the two European powers continued. Finally, large battles broke out in Europe in 1756. Called the 7 Years' War, it covered almost all of the continent and even beyond. In North America, for example, British and French forces fought to gain control of each other's New World lands. In North America, the 7 Years' War was called the French and Indian War. When peace returned to the region in 1763, England, the victor, took over the eastern portion of what would someday become Canada, an area that previously had belonged to France. But the English never insisted that its new citizens of French ancestry adopt English customs. In 1774, in the Quebec Act, England recognized the Roman Catholic Church in North America, to which most French settlers and their descendants belonged. It also established French civil law. Both actions were meant to create goodwill among those of French heritage. Even though the British governed these former French lands, many there still kept their ties to French culture, something that lives on to this very day, sometimes militantly. In fact, the differences between those of French and English ancestry have never been completely resolved in Canada. In the 1970s, tensions boiled over when many of French descent wanted the province of Quebec to secede or break away from the rest of Canada. Voters turned down the proposed secession. The attempt to secede was revived several more times. But each time, the efforts have failed. Even so, French became the language of Quebec schools, and French was declared the official language of the province in 1976. Today, Canada is legally bilingual, with both French and English as the country's official languages. However, most Canadians view their history and culture as primarily British. In fact, during the American Revolutionary War against England, Canadians did not support their neighbors to the south. Instead, they stayed loyal to the mother country. Many Americans who remained loyal to England fled to Canada at war's end. They were called United Empire Loyalists. The Loyalists brought to Canada a belief in representative government, for they had lived in areas with colonial legislatures. To keep the Loyalists happy, the British divided Quebec into two parts, one whose population was mostly of French heritage, the other British. Known as Upper and Lower Canada, each had a legislative assembly elected by the people. The assemblies had no real power, however. Canadians and Americans have almost always had friendly relations with each other. The one exception was during the War of 1812, when England's Navy stopped and then boarded U.S. ships as the American vessels made their way to France. The French were at war with Great Britain at the time. American sailors were sometimes taken captive to serve on British ships. President James Madison objected to these indignities, and the United States Congress, upon his request, declared war on England. American troops invaded Canadian territory, still under British rule. But when the war ended in 1814, neither side kept any land it had won during the conflict, and relations between Canadians and Americans have been friendly